A human being is a tropical animal. If you were to take a person, strip them of their modern layers, and place them in the middle of a Siberian forest in January, they would be dead in less than 4 hours. We are, by all biological standards, built for the savannah. We have thin skin, almost no body hair, and a cooling system based on sweating that is designed to dump heat, not hold it. On paper, we have no business living anywhere that experiences a frost, let alone a 6-month deep freeze. Yet for over 40,000 years, our ancestors didn't just endure the most brutal winters in the history of the planet. They thrived in them. We've been told a story about how they did it, a story of shivering cavemen huddled around a dying fire, desperate and starving. But that story is wrong. It isn't just a simplification. It's a complete misunderstanding of what human beings are. The popular image of the Ice Age survivor is a myth that needs to be dismantled if we want to understand our own history. We imagine them as primitive, struggling to survive the elements. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It tells a story of high-performance engineering, chemical food science, and complex social networks. Our ancestors didn't survive winter by being tougher than us in a physical sense. They survived because they were smarter and more technologically advanced than we give them credit for. They treated the cold not as an enemy to be feared, but as a predictable environmental variable to be managed. This is the first myth we have to pull apart. The idea that early humans were cavemen who relied on natural holes in the ground for survival. If you look at the evidence, the thread of human migration actually moves away from caves as we get more successful. A cave is a fixed point, it doesn't move. If the herds move 50 miles away to find better grazing under the snow, your cave becomes a tomb. To survive a deadly winter, you can't be tied to a hole in the rock. You need architecture. In the late 1960s, a farmer in Ukraine stumbled upon something that completely changed our understanding of Ice Age housing. At a site called Mezerik, archaeologists eventually uncovered 4 huts built entirely out of mammoth bones. These weren't temporary lean-tos. These were engineered structures. The builders used the heavy mandibles of mammoths to create a circular foundation, then stacked the larger leg bones and tusks to create a dome. They didn't just throw the bones in a pile. They used specific bones for specific structural purposes. The tusks were used to support the roof, and the jaw bones were often stacked in a decorative herringbone pattern. One hut alone used the remains of 95 mammoths. Think about the labor involved. These people were moving tons of bone across a frozen landscape. They were lining the interiors with animal hides and packing the exteriors with sod and snow for insulation. Research by archaeologists like Olga Soffer suggests these huts could maintain a stable, livable temperature even when the outside air was minus 40 degrees. This was the birth of real architecture. They weren't hiding in the earth. They were building their own environments. And this thread of engineering, this refusal to accept what nature provided, is what allowed us to push into the most hostile corners of the globe. But a warm house is useless if you can't leave it. This brings us to the second, and perhaps most pervasive, myth. The animal skin clothing myth. We've all seen the movies where early humans are draped in loose, shaggy furs that leave their arms and legs half exposed. If an Ice Age hunter actually dressed like that, they would have been dead before they finished their first hunt. You cannot survive sub-zero temperatures in a draped hide. The moment you move, the warm air trapped against your skin escapes through the gaps. The moment the wind blows, it cuts straight to your core. The reality is that early humans invented what researchers like Ian Gilligan call complex clothing. This is a massive technological leap from simple clothing, which is just a wrap or a cape. Complex clothing is fitted. It has sleeves, it has trousers, it has a hood. To make it, you need a very specific piece of technology, the eyed needle. The oldest bone needles we've found, some dating back nearly 50,000 years in the Denisova cave in Siberia, are miracles of ancient tech. They are thin, polished, and have a tiny drilled hole for thread. This allowed humans to sew multi-layered, airtight garments. They understood the science of insulation long before we had a name for it. They would wear a base layer of fine fur, like Arctic fox or hare, with the hair facing inward against their skin to trap a layer of warm air. Over that, they would wear a thicker layer of reindeer or mammoth hide with the hair facing outward to shed snow and block the wind. This is the same principle used in modern high-altitude gear. At the Sungheir site in Russia, which dates back about 34,000 years, archaeologists found burials where the bodies were covered in thousands of ivory beads. By mapping the position of those beads, they realized they were sewn directly onto fitted leather jackets and trousers. These people weren't wearing rags. They were wearing tailored, decorated, high-performance winter gear. This thread of precision, the ability to stitch a seam so tight that even the wind couldn't find a way in, is the only reason sapiens could walk across the Bering Land Bridge. However, being warm and having a roof over your head only solves half the problem. You still have to eat. And the common myth here is that winter was a time of desperate, constant hunting, where one missed kill meant the end of the tribe. This starvation narrative ignores the fact that early humans were masters of food preservation and chemical engineering. They understood that in winter, the landscape becomes a giant refrigerator. The problem with winter food isn't just finding calories, it's finding the right kind of calories. This is what nutritionists call rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. If you eat only lean meat, like the meat from a deer that has been struggling through a hard winter, your body can't process it. You need fat. Fat is the most precious resource in a deadly winter. It is the fuel for the human furnace. Anthropologist John Speth has written extensively on how early humans managed this fat gap. They didn't just eat the meat, they rendered the fat. They would smash mammoth or bison bones to get at the marrow, and then boil the bone fragments to extract every last gram of bone grease. This tallow was a stable, energy-dense food that could be stored for months. They mixed it with dried meat and berries to create something similar to pemmican, a superfood that provided everything the human body needed to maintain its core temperature in the cold. They also used the earth itself as a tool. In the permafrost regions of the northern hemisphere, early humans dug pits deep into the frozen ground. These weren't just trash pits, they were caches. By burying meat in the permafrost, they could keep it fresh and safe from scavengers for an entire season. Excavations at various sites across the Eurasian steppe have found these natural freezers, still containing the remains of large kills from tens of thousands of years ago. They weren't hunting every day in the snow. They were living off the massive surplus they had accumulated and processed during the autumn. The thread of human survival was tied to their ability to bank energy, turning the bountiful months of the sun into a bridge that crossed the dark months of the frost. This ability to plan and store food reveals a level of social organization that many people still refuse to attribute to primitive humans. And that leads us to the fourth myth. The idea that humans survived winter through sheer physical dominance or a survival of the fittest brutality. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Winter survived through cooperation and what we might call social insurance. If you are a lone hunter or even a single family, a broken leg in December is a death sentence. But human beings during the last glacial period lived in highly connected social networks. We see evidence of this in the movement of materials. Seashells from the Mediterranean have been found in Ice Age sites deep in Central Europe. High-quality flint and obsidian were traded over hundreds of miles. This suggests that even in the dead of winter, groups were not isolated. They were part of a vast web of exchange. These social threads were their ultimate safety net. If one valley was hit by a particularly bad storm, or if a local herd failed to show up, the people there could rely on the hospitality of groups they had traded with or married into. This wasn't just being nice, it was a calculated survival strategy. By maintaining these long-distance relationships, they ensured themselves against local environmental failures. The individualist survivor of the winter is a modern fantasy. The real survivors were the ones who were the best at making friends and maintaining alliances. Now, we have to address the Neanderthal question, because it's the ultimate counterexample to our myth of toughness. Neanderthals were physically much better adapted to the cold than we were. They were shorter, stockier, and had a higher muscle mass, which helps retain heat. They had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years through multiple ice ages. If winter was a contest of physical endurance, they should have won. But they didn't. When sapiens arrived in Europe, they brought with them that thread of complex technology: the needles, the tailored clothing, and the high-capacity storage. While Neanderthals were likely using simple capes and relying on their physical robustness to tough out the cold, sapiens were using technology to insulate themselves from it entirely. Research into occupational sites suggests that sapiens could inhabit much colder environments than Neanderthals ever did. We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we were more fragile and had to invent our way out of that fragility. Our lack of biological adaptation to the cold forced us to develop a technological adaptation that was far more flexible and powerful. This brings us to the fifth and final myth. That winter was a lost season of misery and darkness. We tend to think of our ancestors huddling in their mammoth bone huts, staring into the fire, just waiting for the spring. But the archaeological record shows that winter was actually a period of intense cultural and intellectual productivity. This is the winter workshop theory, when you are trapped inside for 16 hours of darkness, and you have a store of food and a warm fire. You don't just sit there, you work. This was when the beads were carved. This was when the needles were fashioned. This was when the elaborate cave paintings were planned and when the stories were told. Many of the most intricate artifacts we have from the Paleolithic, the Venus figurines, the carved flutes made from bird bones, the detailed lunar calendars etched into antler, were likely the products of these long winter nights. Winter provided the one thing that is essential for the development of complex culture: time. It was a season of enforced leisure for those who were well prepared. While the world outside was frozen and dead, the world inside the hut was vibrating with symbolic thought. This was when the thread of human culture was spun. They weren't just surviving, they were reflecting. They were turning the experience of the cold into art and mythology. They were using the darkness as a canvas. If we pull all these threads together, a new picture of our ancestors emerges. They weren't the victims of the winter. They were its masters. They took the most hostile environment on Earth and used it to trigger a technological and social revolution. The cold didn't break us, it made us modern. The pressure of the ice forced us to become engineers, chemists, architects, and artists. We are the descendants of the people who saw a glacier and didn't run away. They built a house next to it and started sewing. But there is a unifying truth at the center of all of this, one that ties the mammoth bones to the bone needles and the rendered fat to the social networks. The truth is that human survival has never been about our bodies. It has always been about our ability to externalize our survival. We don't grow fur, we build a coat. We don't evolve a better stomach, we build a kitchen. We don't develop a better memory, we build a culture. This is what scientists call niche construction. We don't just adapt to an environment, we create a new environment that suits us. When early humans moved into the Arctic regions, they weren't living in the Arctic. They were living in a tiny, portable version of the African savanna that they carried with them in the form of clothing and shelters. They were tropical, even in the snow. This strategy is incredibly powerful, but it comes with a hidden cost. It makes us entirely dependent on our technology. A wolf is still a wolf if you take away its pack, but a human without their technological thread is nothing. We have spent 50,000 years moving further and further away from our biological roots. We have traded physical resilience for technological brilliance, and that trade worked beautifully until it didn't. For the people of the Ice Age, the threat was the natural world. They knew exactly where the danger was. It was the wind, the snow, and the empty stomach. They built their world to answer those specific threats. They had a level of intimacy with their survival that we can't even fathom. They knew every stitch in their jacket. They knew the history of every bone in their house. They knew the name of every person who might help them if the caches ran dry. Their survival was a conscious daily act of creation. Contrast that with us. We live in a world where the winter has been pushed so far into the background that we've forgotten it exists. We live in climate-controlled bubbles, eating food we didn't grow, wearing clothes we didn't make, and relying on social systems we don't understand. We think we have conquered nature, but all we've really done is hide from it behind a much longer and more fragile thread of technology. In the late 19th century, researchers began to notice a strange pattern in the survival of Arctic explorers. The ones who tried to use modern European technology, heavy wool coats, canned food, and rigid naval discipline, often died of scurvy and exposure. The ones who survived were the ones who threw away their modern gear and copied the technology of the people who had been there for millennia. They learned to sew the way the Ice Age hunters sewed. They learned to eat the fat the way the Ice Age hunters ate. They realized that their advanced civilization had actually made them less capable of surviving the fundamental reality of the planet. Our ancestors' survival in the deep freeze wasn't a miracle. It was a masterpiece of intelligence and preparation. They didn't just survive the deadly winters. They used the cold to forge the very thing we call humanity. They took the thread of their own vulnerability and wove it into a garment that could cover the entire world. But we should be careful not to mistake our comfort for safety. We often look back at the people of the mammoth bone huts with a sense of pity. We see them as primitive because they didn't have the things we have. But they had something we are rapidly losing: a perfect, unbroken connection to the reality of their own survival. They knew how to live when the world wanted them dead. They understood that the thread of life is thin, and that it has to be earned every single day. They weren't cavemen struggling to find a fire. They were the most successful innovators in the history of our species. They looked at a world of ice and saw a world of opportunity. They turned the deadliest season into the forge of our civilization. And they did it all with nothing more than a bone needle and a profound understanding of the fat that keeps the heart beating. So, next time you feel a chill in the air and you reach for the thermostat or pull a pre-packaged meal out of the freezer, take a second to look at your hands. Think about the 50,000 years of cold that those hands are designed to fight. Think about the ancestors who stood in minus 60-degree winds and didn't blink because they knew their seams were tight and their caches were full. They are the reason you are here. They are the reason you can afford to be tropical in a world that is still fundamentally a very cold place. They didn't leave us a world without winter. They left us the tools to ignore it. They taught us how to pretend that we aren't just shivering apes in a frozen wasteland. But the wasteland is still there, just on the other side of the wall. The ice hasn't gone anywhere. It's just waiting for the thread to snap. As you look out your window at the first snow of the year, it's easy to feel a sense of triumph. We have the heat, we have the light, and we have the abundance. We've turned the season of death into a season of holidays and cozy nights. We are the victors of a war that lasted 40 millennia. But history has a way of reminding us that victory is never permanent. The sophisticated systems we rely on, the global supply chains, the power grids, the digital networks, are all just newer, longer versions of that same bone needle thread. They are brilliant, they are precise, and they are incredibly thin. Our ancestors knew that winter was a predator that never stopped hunting. They respected it. They prepared for it. They built their entire lives around the knowledge that the sun would eventually go away and the heat would eventually fail. We have forgotten that respect. We have traded their winter workshop for a permanent summer of convenience. We assume the light will always come on when we flip the switch. We assume the shelf will always be full when we go to the store. But the archaeology of the Ice Age tells us that the only thing that actually lasts is the ability to adapt. The mammoth bone huts are gone. The needles have turned to dust. The caches have been empty for 30,000 years. What remains is the lesson. The lesson is that we are a species that thrives under pressure, a species that finds its greatest strength when the world is at its most hostile. We were forged in the cold. We were shaped by the darkness. Our most profound inventions, the ones that define us as human, were not created in the sun-drenched savannas of our birth, but in the brutal, unforgiving winters of our migration. We are the children of the frost, and that heritage is still there, buried deep in our DNA, waiting for the next time the world turns cold. If we ever find ourselves standing outside the bubble again, stripped of our modern layers and facing the wind, we will have to remember how to sew. We will have to remember how to render the fat, and how to build the huts, and how to trust our neighbors. We will have to find that old thread again. Because the ice is patient. It doesn't care about our thermostats or our supermarkets. It doesn't care about our politics or our pride. It only cares about the laws of thermodynamics. It only cares about the heat that is currently leaving your body and the calories you need to replace it. You should probably take a moment to consider if you've ever actually done anything to deserve your survival. Or if you're just living on the interest of a debt paid by people who were much more capable than you will ever be. They earned your life in the dark 30,000 years ago, and they didn't do it so you could be comfortable. They did it so you could be ready. You are only as safe as the systems you cannot see. If you found this deep dive into our hidden history fascinating, consider subscribing to help us pull on more of these threads. What's one modern convenience you think you could actually survive without if the winter came back tomorrow? Let us know in the comments. The ice didn't go away. We just learned how to pretend it isn't there.